The Curious Tale of Little Red Raging Hood, a Little Were Women's story. To those who have sought refuge from hatred in the small, quiet, and forgotten places. To those who have been hunted for the sake of their skins. To those who have dared to defy the hunter. And to those who follow the trail all the way to the very end. This story is for you. Once, in a time when humanity was racked by epidemics of fear and the world was beset by the turmoil of war, a peaceful valley lay apart from it all, nestled between the guarding walls of high mountains. In that place, no armies clashed, no mobs sought victims by torchlight, and no inquisitors exacted righteous vengeance in the name of deity or despot. The secluded valley was serene and beautiful, though its serenity was a lonely one, and its beauty melancholy. Every sound in the valley, from the gurgling splash of the streams to the wind in the boughs of the ancient forest, seemed like a sigh of longing. The lands beyond had been bright and welcoming once, but no more. Life beyond its walls had become hard and unforgiving. Only the valley's serenity remained untouched by the cruelty which infected the world. It was a timeless sliver of peace, drifting slowly into the warmth of myth. In the valley, sleek rainbow trout jetted through snow-melt pools and streams. Like living gems, they glittered and dove in the crystal-clear water. Small herds of swift roe deer ran in the deep glades, always alert for predators who might enjoy a meal or two of venison. Fat, chirping marmots weaved and dodged the eternal attentions of sharp-eyed eagles on the high meadows. And then, of course, there were 3 other inhabitants, dwelling in a pair of tiny cottages, one on each end of the valley floor. The great forest separated the tidy homesteads. Only a thin, wavering path beneath the overstory suggested their connection. One of the cottages was home to a little maid and her mother. The little maid's elderly grandmother lived in the other. The 3 of them were fortunate indeed to live amongst such beauty. Every day they witnessed the splendor of the forest, the quicksilver song of the streams, and the fierce majesty of the mountains that shielded them from the harms of the outside world. Though the valley was a sanctuary from the outer world, seasons and storms still intruded. Summers were all too brief, winters were much too long, and all who lived there had to toil hard each and every day. Gathering food, keeping their cottage walls dogged, patching their roofs against rain, and mending their clothes demanded much of them. They lived without fear of the violence and turmoil that raged outside, but the 3 who sheltered in the valley had to work hard: mother, grandmother, and little maid. Now, it might be supposed that the little maid suffered terribly in her loneliness, for there was scant rest and no chance for friends or play. It is true, she wanted friends, but she did not suffer. Despite the hardship and the lack of comfort and ease, the maid was happy and found moments of joy and pleasure in her simple life. She took special delight in walking the path to her grandmother's, who was very old and wise and could see many things that others could not. Although the old one lived by herself on the other side of the great forest, she was not lonely, for she was never really alone. The spirit ancestors, echoes of the ancient bloodline from which she was descended, often came to her and kept her company. She conversed with them in long dead languages, smiling and laughing at the mystical secrets that they told her. Some she shared, whispering and smiling, with her little granddaughter. Once every fortnight, the mother sent her young daughter through the great forest to her grandmother's cottage to wake her if she had gone into one of her trances, to bring her a basket of food, and to make sure the path to her door was clear of leaves and fallen branches. The old one doted on her granddaughter and gave her what few gifts she had to give. When the little one was tall enough, her grandmother gave her a bright red cloak with a deep pointed hood. Honored by the special gift, she always wore it, and so came to be called Little Red Hood. One morning, when the falling leaves swirled and the first traces of frost could be seen in the trickling streams, Little Red Hood's mother said,
"Arise, put on your cloak, and go see to your grandmother. Wake her from her trance if she needs to be woken. Clear the path to her cottage if it is littered with fallen leaves and branches, and take along this basket. I have filled it with food and healing herbs to help her through the coming winter."
The scent of snow rolled down to the valley from tall peaks that gleamed like fangs in the sharp sunlight. High overhead, a pair of dark-winged birds whirled and soared under the clouds, croaking out ominous warnings and brushing the ground with corpse shadows as they passed. Yet, Little Red Hood had no cares for warnings or shadows. So happy was she for the chance to see her grandmother. She started from the cottage with a skipping step and a song on her lips. But before she could go far, her mother summoned her back with a stern and serious warning.
"Little Red Hood, come here."
Her mother called from the doorway, watching the dark shapes in the sky with a frown.
"Before you go, listen carefully to what I tell you.
Yes, Mother.
Little Red Hood replied cheerfully.
I am listening.
Stay in the middle of the path. Walk quietly and do not stray, no matter what interesting or pretty things you may see,"
she warned.
Yes, Mother.
Little Red Hood nodded.
I will stay on the path.
"Do not stop to talk to anyone you should meet, no matter how kind they may seem,"
she continued.
"For there have been reports from the other valleys, strangers seeking a way in from the lands beyond the mountains."
No, Mother.
Little Red Hood agreed.
I won't talk to anyone.
And she wondered about the other valleys, the strangers, and the lands beyond.
"No matter what may happen, keep your destination a secret, for our secrets are our survival."
Yes, Mother.
Little Red Hood nodded.
I will tell no one of my destination.
With that, she set off into the forest, while her mother watched carefully from the doorstep. As she began her journey, Little Red Hood minded her mother's instructions carefully. She walked in the middle of the path, stayed completely silent, and revealed nothing of her destination. The entrance to the trail was well lit by rays of bright autumn sunshine that shone through the trees. Mischievous squirrels, chipmunks, and wood mice scampered away as she approached, hiding in the branches, squeaking and rustling in the fallen foliage as they hunted for food to get them through the approaching winter. She smiled at their antics, but she did not stop to chase them, no matter how much they squeaked, for she was mindful still of her mother's words, and on she went. Soon, the path turned from the streams and sunlit patches and plunged into the shadowy heart of the forest. The rays of sunshine became dimmer and more scattered, and the limbs of the great trees more gnarled, reaching up to blot out the light. Little Red Hood did not like this part of the forest, and her pace quickened as she went along. She strode briskly and with purpose, right in the middle of the trail. On and on she walked, until at last she came up to a small clearing. Here, an ancient grove stood off to one side of the trail, marking a place where grandmother said the spirit ancestors tarried in their journeys between their world and the world of the valley. The spirits gathered in this place to transact their secret business, whispering and cavorting out of sight of the living. Little Red Hood's limbs felt cold as she paused there. She looked upon the grove and shivered, but not from the cold. She felt eyes upon her, and their gaze was not wholesome. Pulling her cloak tight around her shoulders, she was about to quicken her pace when she noticed something. A bright and lively splash of color lying on the ground. A sweet scent carried by the cold breeze drew her in, enticing her to step off the path. As she walked closer and closer, she saw that it was a beautiful flower, richer and redder than anything she had ever seen. It was a rose, deeper and more vibrant than any flower that had ever grown in the valley, even more beautiful than her own beloved cloak. She stooped to pick it up, but a winged shadow passed overhead, and a harsh call stopped her in her tracks. A bird swooped low over the treetops so that she could see its feathers were the deep black of the nighttime sky, as dark as the spaces between the stars, with a streak of white on each wing. All at once, a sweet and kindly voice called out to her.
Good morning, little girl.
Little Red Hood was startled but unafraid. She did not think that any wicked thing could have so kindly a voice, so she turned towards it and smiled.
What is your name, little girl?
The man's voice called out sweetly.
I am called Little Red Hood, if you please, sir,
Came her reply. She curtsied as she had seen the princesses and fine ladies do in the books that she read in her grandmother's cottage.
And what have you got in your basket, little Red Hood?
Called the voice.
Food and healing herbs, sir.
At that, there was a rustling in the foliage, and out stepped a tall, thin man wearing boots which had been polished into a brilliant shine. He was dressed in a crisp, elegant uniform, well worn, but clean and cleverly mended. A big wolfskin coat was thrown over the uniform, warm and soft, with fine gray fur. The wolf's head was still attached, pulled up to form a sheltering hood. An old musket was slung over one shoulder, and a well-used saber was slung over the other, dangling down to his hip. Little Red Hood's mother and grandmother would have known at once that he was a hunter, well paid for the bounties he took, and quite good at his chosen profession. Little Red Hood did not know this. She only saw the pretty rose and only heard his kind voice. Looking down at Little Red Hood, he smiled and cocked his head to the side.
And where are you going with this basket, little Red Hood?
Asked the hunter.
I am going to my grandmother, sir.
She answered.
Where does your grandmother live, little Red Hood?
She noticed that the eyes of the wolf's head hood had been sewn closed to keep out the rain.
She lives at the end of this path through the great forest in a little cottage near the foot of the mountains, sir. But it is a long walk from here, as the path winds and curves, so I mustn't tarry.
The hunter looked at her with a growing smile before he said sternly,
No, you mustn't tarry. Get on your way now, little Red Hood. And please, wish your grandmother a good evening from me when you see her.
With a rustle and swirl of his wolfskin cloak, he vanished into the trees, leaving Little Red Hood all alone. She stood there for a time, the red rose losing its scent in the chill as she wondered where he was going. She strained her ears to hear him trotting swiftly through the undergrowth, straight into the forest. As the sounds faded away, she bent down and picked up the red rose, placing it in her basket. There was something strange about the rose that she had not noticed before. Another scent that mingled with the sweet perfume. Something sour and rotten. She kept it just the same and continued along the winding trail all the rest of the way through the forest. The walk seemed longer than usual. The wind seemed colder than it ought for that time of year, and her burden seemed heavier with each step. But she continued onward. It was late when she finally arrived, chilled and shivering, at the entrance to her grandmother's cottage. The leaves on the doorstep had been brushed aside, as though her grandmother had been expecting someone. Little Red Hood knocked at the door and called out,
Good evening, grandmother. It is I, Little Red Hood. I have brought you food and healing herbs, and here is a red rose that I found in the clearing.
A voice called, thin and weak, from within the cottage.
Come in, dear. Come in. Lift the latch and the door will fly open.
Obediently, Little Red Hood lifted the latch and the door flew open. The room within was dark and she could see nothing. She blinked in the gloom before stepping through the threshold, and she closed the door behind her to keep out the chill. Soft darkness washed over her, and all was quiet and still. She moved forward, her eyes adjusting to the low light, and she saw what she always saw within. A little stove filled with flickering embers and ash. A few old shelves, bare except for some crumbling books. And a big bed, cloaked in thick curtains and piled high with hides and furs. When she stopped to light a candle, the curtains parted and a peering eye looked out inquisitively.
Grandmother, is that you? Are you awake?
Asked Little Red Hood.
Oh, yes, dear. I am awake.
The thin, weak voice replied.
Come closer. Oh, you are shivering with the cold. The fire has gone out. Why don't you take off your cloak and come get into bed with me and warm yourself?
Shivering, she stepped slowly forward, and the voice from the bed said,
Get in, my dear.
As she slipped in, her shivering became more intense, and the ancient frame groaned and creaked. She laid her head down on the thin pillow, and a voice spoke in the darkness.
My, what big ears you have, my child.
All the better to hear you with, grandmother.
The bed continued creaking as Little Red Hood's body shivered, and she strained to pull the blankets over her shoulders. Again came the voice out of the darkness next to her.
My, what big eyes you have, my child.
All the better to see you with, grandmother.
And in the darkness, Little Red Hood's eyes did appear large and lustrous. As she turned her head on the pillow, the face next to her stared in wonder, for two pale blue lights flickered deep inside her eyes. Then the voice spoke again.
But dear child, what a big nose you have.
All the better to smell you with, grandmother.
The sound of a breath inhaled through two large nostrils seemed to stir the bedposts themselves as Little Red Hood snuffed up the odors and scents from the body that lay next to her. The bed now groaned terribly, and even though she held onto the warm covers, they could not cover all of her body. Little Red Hood shuddered, shaking the frame and making the bedposts creak ever more loudly, like the masts of a galleon running before a storm. Then the voice spoke again.
My goodness, child, what a big mouth you have! And such teeth!
Little Red Hood flung aside the bedclothes, only to find the hunter, still clad in his wolfskin cloak. He grinned at first, reveling in his trickery, but his grin soon vanished. Little Red Hood's lips parted to reveal her mouth, full of teeth now grown long and deadly. For the young maid had grown and changed. Her ears were large and pointed. Her eyes glared with an icy blue light. Her nose extended to a long, sharp snout. Her skin had grown a pelt of soft, silky fur, and her arms and legs had transformed into long, terrible limbs tipped with vicious claws that reached out for the hunter. Little Red Hood bared her teeth, razor-edged and hungry, and she howled out,
"What have you done to my grandmother?"
But before she could seize the hunter, he rolled out of the bed and scuttled away like an insect into the darkened corner. Frightened, he jostled Little Red Hood's basket, revealing its bloody contents and spilling them out, drip, drip, dripping onto the cottage floor, staining the rose an even deeper shade of red. The scent of blood and howling wolf-like form seemed to jar the hunter from his fearful stupor, and he grabbed his loaded musket from behind the door, ready to take one of the 3 trophies he had come to the valley to claim. Little Red Hood's sharp nose caught the scent of the silver bullet in his musket, its muzzle now pointed directly at her heart. Though the hands that held the weapon trembled, the hunter had fired it many times before, and he would not miss his target. Sensing this, Little Red Hood gathered herself to leap, determined that if she must die, she would end the hunter's life before she went to join her spirit ancestors. The hunter's practiced finger began to squeeze the trigger, and the icy blue light in Little Red Hood's eyes shone out fiercely as she roared her defiance. At that moment, the latch on the cottage door lifted, and the door tore away from its hinges. Little Red Hood's grandmother appeared, swift and deadly, uttering a frightful roar through gaping jaws. Before the hunter could pull the trigger, Grandmother was upon him, tearing his head from his body with 1-2 swipes of her ancient claws. The severed head rolled across the floor and was promptly stopped by the corner bedpost. And that was the end of the hunter. Little Red Hood was saved, and she yelped with joy, but the night was far from over. Her grandmother had much to share with the Little Red Hood. The young wolf maid had only just begun to appreciate the gift. So she spent the night with her grandmother, prowling in the forest and talking to her ancestors of long, hard migrations, of hunts for the great, shaggy beasts that once walked the earth, and of the love and loyalty of pack, the sacred duty to protect the weak and outcast, and the many blessings of Mother Luna. As the hunter's moon faded with the dawn, she journeyed back across the woods to tell her mother the tale and relate everything that she had learned. For the rest of her life, she always minded her mother and kept her secrets for the sake of herself and for those who would come after her. From that day forward, she came to be known as Little Red Raging Hood. And one day, she taught her own cubs this important lesson.
Obey your elders, listen well, though I be old and gray. The foes I fought and vanquished once may come again someday. So please remember, cub of mine, these words of sages wise. Our predator becomes our prey when those who kneel arise. We creep and stalk whene'er they come. They shall not take my hide, for these green valleys are our homes, with forests deep and wide. I bid you, cub, be cunning, and deft stratagems devise. Make prey of all our predators, and upward we shall rise.